Okay. All right. So I'm gonna go to today's lecture. This guy, which is just gonna link to that. And I'm just gonna walk through this example. So, down. Okay. All right. So this is again like anyone is free to not use this template, but in my experience doing this, people who deviate from it end up running into all kinds of funky issues. So if you genuinely want to do something different, that's fine. But if you just can't quite figure out how this works, and so you start going down a rabbit hole of trying to do other things, I would avoid that. But there are definitely other like architectures, other ways of structuring this, that's fine. So if you have something that you genuinely want to do differently, that is absolutely fine. All right, so the application, this is just the dummy wines application, so there's nothing especially interesting, but I'll just walk through this real quick. So it's got an API route, and then that API route is going to go to this URLs, and then it's just got two subroutes. So you can basically uh, you can list all the wines, or you can basically create a wine. So there's only a limited subset of the CRUD functionality. You can get wines, and you can create a wine. You can also do this, but this is not supported by the interface. So that's just very boilerplate. The front end, same way. And we have the three-part structure, which is actually a little more visible in the Docker Compose. So we have two Docker Compose files now. One is for a development environment, and one is for production environment. So this is a common thing that you'll see on the job. You'll have, like different kinds of environments. So you have the same application essentially, but depending on like where it is, the environment, and what the purpose of it is, things will be different. So in production, you're going to have everything you need. Everything's going to be real, etc. And locally, you're not going to want to connect to the actual users database or whatever. So you're going to have local versions of things. You might be missing certain kinds of functionality. Certain other components might be mocked or faked. And then you can have lots of environments. You can have a local development. You could have like a staging environment for testing things. You can have a quality, a a QA environment for like stuff that's about to go to production, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll see all kinds of variations on the job. So let's see. Sandy, can you tell me about what's happening in this Docker file?
Oof, it's been a while.
Just whatever you can. You can, at a high level, you can focus on one of these.
um, I guess I'll do the database. You're saying that the database will be a Postgres with the tag of version 15.
Mhm.
Um, I forget what the volumes is.
Okay.
Um, and then your environment, um, yeah, you're assigning the database name and the user and the password.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Good. So can you tell me, maybe at a more general level, like what is the point of a Docker Compose file?
To so when you run it, it builds the image, the Docker image, um, as soon as you, I guess, pull it.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah, so the Docker Compose, the real point of the Docker Compose image is to like compose multiple Docker containers. You can use just one, obviously. You can have just one container or one service defined in a Docker Compose file, but the real purpose is to have multiple services. So instead of I want to spin up this container and then spin up this container and then spin up this container individually on the command line and then make sure they're connected and so on. Docker Compose is just another layer on top of everything else that allows you to define an entire application of containers which are able to coordinate with each other. So instead of thinking about one container at a time, you think about the entire application, which is composed of multiple containers. And the structure here is each service is going to be a container. And some of these keys are keywords. They're actual Docker Compose keywords, and some of them are just arbitrary names. So this is an arbitrary name: API Nginx and DB. We could give these whatever name we want. But the rest of this stuff is keywords. So actually, this in the more recent versions of Docker Compose, you don't need the version anymore, so you could actually get rid of that. But I'll leave it for now. So we have an API service, and well, we'll start with the database. So the database service is going to be a Postgres image. We give it some configuration. So can anyone tell me what the volumes is?
That's just storing the data, right? So it's like making a drive so whenever you update the database, that's where it's stored. And then that way, if you Docker Compose down and Docker Compose up, your data stays.
Yeah, exactly. So a volume, so containers are meant to be ephemeral. They're meant to be basically immutable. So if you have, let's take a step back, maybe a step up. What's the difference between a pure function and an impure function?
A pure function doesn't have any side effects.
Yeah, okay. So it doesn't have any side effects. Are there any other properties of a pure function?
It doesn't rely on anything outside the function.
Okay, good. Yeah. So it doesn't rely on anything outside of itself. It's its own little self-contained world. So it doesn't take in anything from the outside world, and it doesn't do anything to the outside world. Are there any other properties of a pure function? There's one more important one. So let me write an example real quick. So I'm going to write a function. So what's going to happen if I call f?
It'll give you a random integer between 1 and 10.
Uh-huh.
So is the third property that it gives you consistent results every time?
Yeah. Yeah. So the third property is basically I forget what it's the term slips my mind actually, but it's not referential transparency. Maybe it's referential transparency, but it's every time I give it. So if I give this thing if I call this function with the integer 2, I should get the same result every single time. If I'm getting a random number or some, there's some lack of determinism, I don't know what the response is. So what you want to be able to do with a pure function is essentially create like a table, like a lookup table. For this input parameter, here's my return value. For this input parameter, here's my return value. And every time I call it, I get the same result. So I could, in theory, replace the function with just like a giant dictionary. So that's the third thing. And that's important here for Docker because the ideal and the purpose of Docker is to basically create a reproducible environment, a reproducible, essentially virtual machine. So every time I spin up my API container, it's the exact same. And I spin it down and I spin it back up, and it's the exact same. And I spin it down, and if I spin it down and spin it up 1,000 times, on the 1,001st time I spin it up, it should be exactly the same as it was on the first time. So you get reproducibility and predictability, right? So anything that you do, if I spin up the API container and I create some variables or do whatever, or even write to the file system on the container, when I spin it down, that all goes away, right? That all goes away because when I spin it up again, it needs to be the exact same. A volume is kind of an escape hatch out of that ephemeralness. So a volume is just a mapping from the host file system into the container. So it's basically like plugging in a USB drive or something like that. So every time I start up the container, I can get this extra thing, which is going to be attached to my file system. So for a database, if I'm actually using the database, I spin up the container and I start saving users, right? So I have a bunch of users in my database now. And when I spin that container down, I may or may not want all those users to go away, right? I may want to spin down the container and then upgrade Postgres. So now I want to upgrade Postgres to 16, but I want to keep all my original data. So that's why you would use a volume. So it would allow you to modify the container to create a new container, but to keep all of that data. Okay, and then environment is just going to be environment variables. So these are environment variables that'll be injected into the container every time it starts up. So we've defined some of these, and we'll see where we actually will supply those. And then Nginx, it's the same thing, except instead of pulling from Docker Hub, we're gonna use a local Docker file. And then, yeah. Okay, so that's basically it. So when we spin this up, we should expect to see.
Yeah. Sorry, one question. What does restart always mean?
That just means, so Docker Compose also gives you some extra like meta functionality. So if the Nginx container fails or goes down for whatever reason, it will spin one back up. So there are much more sophisticated versions of this. Container orchestration tools, the most famous of which is Kubernetes. So it allows you to do lots of other things, like I want to have at least 3 instances of my API container up at any time. And if something happens, then I spin up a new one, etc. So you don't have to have this right now. This is, yeah. Okay, so that's the Docker Compose. Now we have a bunch of environment variables, but those aren't immediately here. So in order to inject those environment variables, we're gonna take another step back, and we're gonna actually run this compose file with a script. So here's the run compose dev script. And here, when we run this script, we're going to basically inject a bunch of these a bunch of these environment variables into the host machine's environment. So when I run this script, I'm going to create these variables. So they're going to be available in my local environment. Let me just spin this up. So if I do something like echo path, here's my path variable. So this is an environment variable, which is available right now. There's a whole bunch. Obviously, you can create your own. Some of them are going to be associated with your like your bash profile or zshrc or whatever, and you know you can define environment variables in those configuration files. So every time you start up a terminal, it will create those and inject those into your terminal environment. There are also environment variables you can create just like, when I run this command, I want this environment variable to be there. And then when the command is finished, that environment variable is gone. So that's what this is doing right here. So it's going to create some environment variables, and then those environment variables are going to be available. So Docker Compose is smart enough to pick those up. So notice the $sign here, just like I had here in the terminal. So it's going to pick up, it's going to look for an environment variable called secret key, and it's just going to assign that here. So I create an environment variable in my host machine, and then I basically copy that over into the container. So that's what all of these are doing. Okay, and then I just run Docker Compose up. No surprise there. And then because it takes a few seconds for the Postgres container to actually be ready to accept connections and do stuff, we're gonna sleep. A more sophisticated version of that would be to poll the container. So you could do like a health check or a poll to make sure that the container's up and then do it. But this is simpler. So we're not going to add that additional logic. We're just going to wait some arbitrary time, and then we're going to run migrations. So we're going to hit the API container, and that API container is going to talk to the database, and it's going to actually create all of the tables that we need. All right, any questions about that so far? There's a lot of steps here, but if you follow the template, you should be fine. All right, so I'm gonna did I actually? Oh, I added something here. So I'm gonna go ahead and run this, and we'll make sure that it works. So I'm gonna run Docker Compose dev, and because I'm in my development environment, all of these are just, it doesn't matter what they are, right? So debug will be true, but the rest of these like credentials and keys don't actually matter. So I can check these in because they're basically fake. In production, I won't be able to do that, right? I don't want to check in my production secret key to my GitHub repo. And we'll see what the prod version looks like in a second. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. So /run compose dev. And Docker is not running. So let me start that up. Oh, I should talk about the Nginx thing. All right, so the Nginx container, this is going to be a little bit different than what we've done before. So before, this is basically what we've done, right? To get our front end application, you run npm run build on the front end, which is going to execute this. And what does this command do?
it creates the production version of your front end, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it'll create a new folder called build in this case, but it could be called anything really. But so it'll create a folder, and it's basically going to take all of your fancy React code and turn it into very boring JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And then here, so before what we've done is you've manually run that build command locally, and then you get the build file, and then we copy that over. Copy over the dist folder, which has all of your like compiled or transpiled React code, and we copy it over into the default directory of the Nginx container to make this a little bit more robust and predictable, because you can build you can build it on your local machine, but there might be some variations depending on what you have available on your local machine. So in order to do that, we're going to do something a little bit more complicated. So there's a pattern you can use in Docker called the builder pattern. And the builder pattern basically allows you to create an intermediate container. So we're gonna create a container whose only job is to run essentially npm run build. So in order to do that, we need node. So in order to run npm build, we need node, but in order to actually serve up our container on Nginx, we don't need node on the Nginx container. So there are some dependencies that we need to get to create this this folder with all the files in it, but ultimately we just need those files. We don't need all the stuff that we needed to create the files. So we're going to create a node container, and we're gonna run our npm run build here, and then we're just gonna get rid of it. We're gonna copy over the files that were created, and then this is gonna be gone. So all of this stuff will just disappear. Okay. I have an issue with this here. Okay, let me stop some of this other stuff. Docker. This is my work computer here. All right. So I'm gonna go ahead and run this. There's actually another script for stopping everything. So /stop compose dev. All right. So now I'm gonna try running this one more time. Wait 10 seconds, then I should try to run the migrations. Okay. All right. So we should, if I do Docker PS now, Docker PS, I should have my 3 containers: the API container, the web server, and then the database. So now I'm gonna go here, and I'll go to localhost, and we have our application. So I can go to list wines, there's nothing. I can go to create wine, blah, 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 blah. And then if I list wines, I should see that there. So so this is working. We don't really care what this application actually is right now. We just want to make sure all the infrastructure works. So that is now working. All right. So if you were developing what you would do is, as you're developing locally, let's say you want to add something, you want to add a button or something, you would go in here to your code as usual. You could also just run this kind of locally as you're developing. Once you're sure that it's working, you have your new feature added or whatever, then you're going to run the local Docker Compose to make sure that the entire application works with your new feature in it. And then once that works, you can push up, create a PR and merge it in. And then you'll want to deploy your updated application to production. So let's look at the production version. I'll spin this down, and then we'll look at the production environment. So here's the Docker Compose for production. It's basically the same, a couple differences. So one is that all of these images now are going to get pulled from your Docker Hub account. So we're not going to use local Docker files. So we're not going to go copy all of our entire repo onto the EC2 instance with the Docker files and then build the Docker files. We're going to have all of that stuff available, the most recent versions of your application, of each container in your application on Docker Hub, and we'll pull directly from there. So we've got all these environment variables, same thing, blah, blah, blah. So everything's basically the same here, except it assumes that this stuff is on Docker Hub instead of in local Docker files. And then the prod script is going to be a little different because we don't want to check in your, you don't want to check in your secret key to GitHub. So we're going to have to pull this dynamically. So does anyone know what this like $1, 2, 3, etc. is?
Are those just like the 1, 2, 3? Those are variables, and then the $sign is just how you kind of call them or something, and they're in another file.
Yeah. So these do represent variables. This like $1, 2, 3. These are kind of special things in Bash, and it basically these are the parameters that you pass in. So when I call run compose prod, I need to give it parameters. This is the first parameter and the second parameter and the third parameter, etc. So if I call /run compose prod, I need to pass in the secret key. So this is my secret key. And then the second parameter is whether or not it's debugged. So I'll say false. And the third parameter is going to be the Postgres database name, which you can call whatever you want, etc. So these values are only going to be present when you run the container, and you're going to run it on your EC2 instance. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, so for production, the way it'll work is, let's say again you're developing, so you add a button to your front end. Once it's working, you run Docker Compose dev. So you run the entire application locally. You make sure that it works. Once it works, then you're gonna create a PR, and that PR will get merged into main. And then once it's in main, you're going to want to create a release. So a release is basically just a versioned version of your application. So once you want to update your application in production, what you're going to do is you'll pull down main. So the most up-to-date version of main, and then you're going to have to push all of these new container images, all these new images to your Docker Hub account. And there's a script for that. So where is that? build and push images. So you might not need these flags depending on what you're doing, but that's fine. So basically, your application is also going to need a URL. So your front end is going to need to know what to talk to. So it's going to assume that you've created an EC2 instance and you have an IP address associated with that, because your front end is going to need that IP address. So you're going to supply that, and then you're also going to supply the new version. So 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, whatever the case is. All right, so in order to do this, I'm gonna have to first create an EC2 instance. So this assumes that you have an EC2 instance created. So let's go to get that up here. I'm gonna go create an EC2 instance. Here what that's called. And then I'll use all the defaults here. I'm actually, this particular computer is on a new Mac, so I could change that, but I'll just leave that for now. And then I'll create a new key pair since I don't have that here. This. Okay, and then I'm gonna allow SSH traffic from, I'll just say my IP, and I will allow HTTP traffic on port 80 so that, clients can communicate with this, and everything else should be good. So I'm gonna launch that instance. All right, so I'm gonna go to my instances and I'll click on this. Let's see. I'll wait for this to start up so I can click the connect, and it's gonna give me a couple commands to run. Okay, so that is up. And let's see. Click on the SSH client here. So I need to modify the permissions of the PEM file. So I'm gonna go here, split this. And I'll run this command. Okay, so I've updated the permissions here on my key. So now I should be able to SSH in there. All right, so I'm now in my EC2 instance. All right, so I'm going to exit from there. Okay, so I should have my IP address for this. So I'm going to copy that. And then let's see. I don't have all my shortcuts here. All right, so we're now going to build and push the image. So let's assume that this application is a new version and we want to go ahead and push it there. So I'm going to run /build and push images, and I'm going to pass it this URL right there. So that's $1. That's the first parameter that I pass the script. And the second one is going to be the version number. So I'll say this is like 2.3. So go ahead and run that. Just to be lazy, you should never do this. I'm gonna do it. So the next step is once we push the updated version of all our containers to Docker Hub, then what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna go ahead and run the Docker Compose script on the EC2 instance. But because this is the first time, we've set up the EC2 instance, we're gonna have to install Docker Compose and everything. So we're gonna copy over a script. So this is set up EC2. So this will just install Docker and Docker Compose. So I'm gonna go, let's see. Copy this over. And then I'm gonna copy over. So I have this script on my local host machine. I want to copy it into the EC2 container so that I can run it. So to do that, you'll use a scp. You can basically start with the SSH command and modify it if you're lazy like me. So scp, so this is secure copy. So this will copy files, but it's going to take a credential, which in this case is the same PEM file. And I'm going to copy something from my local machine. So from goes here. So I want setup EC2, and then I'm going to copy it into this. But I need to specify the users. So that'll be EC2-user and then colon whatever this is. And let me check. I think I have to specify a file path. Let me see if I have this command in the README. So here's an example command. I could actually I'll just go ahead and run this. Okay, so that goes at the end. Oops, my bad. So I'll copy this. And I'm going to go here. So I'll just copy everything now. So I'm going to copy over the script. This is going to run everything. And I'll copy over the prod script for Docker Compose and then the prod Docker Compose file. And then this is going to be different. So I'll copy this. And the directory that I'm going to copy it into is going to be home/EC2 user. Okay, I've got the wrong PEM file. So let's jump over here. Let's see. Compose key. Yeah. Okay, so finally got it right. Now I can go back here and I can SSH back in to my EC2 instance. And if I do ls, I should see those files that I'm going to need. So first, I'm going to run the setup EC2 script. So /setup EC2. That's just going to install Docker and Docker Compose. Okay. And then from there, I can actually go ahead and run the Docker Compose prod script. So /run compose prod. And I'm going to look at this where's the script here? So I'm going to need to supply all of these values to the script. So for these purposes, I don't care, but you could have a very long secret key. So my secret key, and then debug, let's say false. And then the Postgres database, we can give it any name we want. I think this is wine. I'll just call it wines. And then the Postgres user is my user. And then the password is my password. And then the version is going to be whatever we just pushed up. And I actually forget what that was, 1 dot or 2.3, I think, something like that. Let's check that. Two dot three. Okay. So when I run this, this should give me the updated version of my application. Interesting. Let me check some stuff here. Backend prod. So it's possible that there's a naming difference. So let me look here. Backend prod, new version, Docker Hub account should have come from this script. Chad Mowbray / So let me go to my Docker Hub account and make sure that I actually have the application there. Okay, so web server prod and API prod. Let me see what versions I have. 2.3. So I've got 2.3 here. So that looks right. And then I'm going to go back and look at web server prod. I also have 2.3. So that looks right. So that's what I would expect to see here. So let me double check the command that I ran. Maybe I messed something up when I ran it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let me just try pulling. Let me try pulling this image directly, for example. So Docker pull, and then the tag is 2.3. Interesting.
On your Docker Hub, it was API prod, not backend prod.
Okay, is that let me double check that. Thank you for noticing. Let me backend prod. Yes. Okay, so let me change this to API prod. And then web server prod, I think, was right. So I'm gonna rerun this command again, and I'm gonna update my Docker Compose prod file in the EC2 instance. All right, so now I'm gonna go back here and I'll do ls, and I can go ahead and cat this file just to confirm that I actually updated it. So I can do cat Docker Compose prod YAML, and I can see, okay, API prod. So I did actually update that. So now I'm going to run this command one more time. So I actually get a warning here telling me that version is obsolete now. So you can just get rid of this, but for old time's sake, I'll leave it in.
I have a question in the meantime to make sure that I'm following correctly. So in previous iterations of us doing this process of uploading to our AWS, I think that we would SSH into the instance and clone our repo is the idea now that instead of doing that, we are basically kind of pulling the version of our application from Docker Hub. And so it kind of skips that needing to clone or anything here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So we don't need any actual like application source code here.
Okay.
All we need is all we really need is the Docker Compose file that we actually want to run.
Okay.
The other
Thank you.
stuff is just
Yeah.
convenience, but all we really need is the definition, the Docker Compose definition, which is going to pull. So you're basically controlling what you're running in production based on the images that you have. Okay,
Is
so
this the way it would work like in the real world, but maybe not using Docker Hub?
yeah, people do use Docker Hub. You would typically use like a private repo essentially. And there are also other container registries. AWS has its own container registry called ECR, and you know there are other versions. You know, every cloud provider will have their own registry, and there are other competitors too. But there's nothing, you know, proprietary here, so I just have it in a public repo.
That makes sense.
All right, so let's go here, and I'm gonna copy this IP address, and we'll see if it works. Okay, so list wines, I shouldn't have any. I'll create a wine, and I can list them, and there it is. So this is now working in production. And let's say I'll just go through the process of, for example, doing an update. All right, so I've got this working, it's great, but now I want to add a new feature. So I'll just go to the front end and I'll do something notional here. App.jsx. I'll just write new. Okay, so I save this, and then I'm gonna go ahead and run this locally. So Docker PS. Why is this still running? Shortcuts, this is driving me nuts. Where are you, Docker desktop? Here we go. So I'm gonna stop. I'm just gonna. Okay. All right, so this is good. So I've made a change. So now I'm gonna run this. I'm gonna, you know, I've tested it locally, blah, blah, blah. It's working. So now I'm gonna try running it with Docker Compose dev. So / Docker Compose. I'm gonna run the script. This will be run. uncompose dev. It's all cached, so we'll see if that actually worked. We'll go to localhost. Okay. So I've got the updated version. It works. I play around with it, great. Okay. And notice here that this stuck around. So why is this wine still available to me, even though I spun down the container and spun it back up?
It's attached to that volume.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I created a row in the database, and because that database is a volume, the actual information is saved on my host machine, and then every time I spin up a container, that file system gets mapped on and it's available. Okay. All right, cool. So I'm sure this works locally. It's good. I tested it locally, and then I tested it in the local compose script. Everything works. So now I'm going to create a PR. I create a PR that gets merged into main. And now I want to update the application in production now. So I can run, Docker pull, get the most up to date version of the application locally. And then I have to push up the new version of the containers. So I'm going to run / build and push images. And let me find. Okay, cool. So instead of 2.3, let's make it 2.4. I'll use the same IP address, so that doesn't need to change, but I'm going to update this. And if I go to my Docker Hub, once it actually finishes, I should see 2.4, a new tag here. All right, cool. So now I'm going to go make sure that that actually works here. So if I refresh this, okay, I have 2.4 now. So now what I'm going to do is I'm already SSH'd in, so I can run Docker compose. Let me see the dash here. Now let me make sure here. Pass in the file. I'm just going to copy this. See. And so I'm going to spin down the currently running application in production. Okay, so now I'm going to just make sure that it's not working. So if I go to production, I'll do a hard refresh here, and I get an error because there's nothing running. So let's actually update the application. So to do that, it's just going to be as simple as 2.4. and then I'll wait 10 seconds and run the migrations. In this case, there's no need to run migrations, but it's just part of the script. All right, so now I should be able to get there now. So now I have the updated, I've just deployed the updated version of my application. Okay. Any questions?
This probably is beyond the scope of what we're doing, but how would you do it without having the site go down?
Yeah, so it's tough to do manually like that. You got like a zero downtime upgrade. There are ways of doing that. So if you're using like a managed service like AWS, just show you real quick. ECR, no, ECS. So Amazon ECS is basically a way for you to do something similar to what we're doing right now, where you have, you have they call it a task. You have a task definition, and you can define all the containers that you want, and then you basically need some kind of orchestration in order to do that. So the way it works is basically you'll have your currently running application, and then you'll have your update, and then you in the background you'll basically spin up a new version of the application. So it's just going to be sitting there, not handling requests or doing anything, but it'll exist. The new version will exist, and then it'll just switch over. So there are ways of doing that. To try to do it manually would be yeah. And it's also, with a stateless application, it's pretty easy to do something like that. With databases and stuff like that, it's a little trickier. So let me do ECS blue, green. So one like pattern is a blue-green deployment, which is basically what I described, where you have the current application and then you have the new version, and it's just kind of running it independently. You can also do things like switch over 10% of traffic for a while, and then make sure that everything's working, and then switch over everyone else and stuff like that. So there are different strategies for doing that. Yeah, and you can also roll back, for example. So if you deploy the new version and you switch everyone over, or you switch over some subset and you realize there's a problem, you just roll it back. So that's one reason, even though we're not guaranteeing zero downtime application upgrades, it's like 10-second application upgrades, which is not too bad doing it this way. And if there is a problem, so let's just say, for example, I'm running this and I realize, oh no, there's a bug that I missed and this application isn't working right now. So all you have to do is Docker compose down. You have another container up that puts up a banner. It says, sorry, we're doing maintenance. And then I'm going to revert. So I'm going to go back to version 2.3, which I know works. And I'm going to deploy that now. So that actually should be fine. So I'll do a hard refresh, and I have the old. So I just reverted the deployment. And if you just rely on the default latest tag, then you can't really do that. And you can go back to any arbitrary version, right? If you realize that 3 upgrades later there's some critical bug that snuck in, you can revert to any version. So all of the pain and suffering that you've gone through with Docker and Docker Compose, it's for this. That's why it exists. And the more complicated your application is, the more important it is to have this kind of ability to just like reproduce it, and it's the same everywhere. Okay, cool. Yeah, so once you guys keep working, and then the goal is to get it deployed. If you don't make it, it's not the end of the world or anything, but that should be the goal. Yeah, I would say that should be a priority, even if everything's not perfect on the application. As long as you don't have to add the next feature, as long as it works. And then yeah, later today I think we'll meet up and I'll talk a little bit about the group projects. We can maybe start to create the groups, and I'll ask people about one important question. I know that this cohort in particular, there's a lot of like reservists and stuff like that, so people kind of coming in and out. So I'm gonna also check on people's availability for the next week and probably use that to choose groups. All right, but I've got 4 projects, and I can't guarantee that you're gonna get the project you want or whatever. We'll try. I can't make any firm guarantees, but yeah, we'll talk about it and we'll try to come up with something that works for everyone. All right, so I'll stop recording.